There's been a lot of talk about what happened to Tupac on the day he got shot. Keith D claimed he was part of the murder squad, and a few years later, he backtracked. But now, Suge Knight's former cellmate has stepped forward, sharing a version of events that changes everything. According to him, Tupac's death was orchestrated by someone we've all overlooked. Let me break it down. The setup, betrayal in Vegas. They told us Tupac's death was just another random drive-by. They told us the case was unsolved. But Suge Knight's former cellmate says the truth has been rotting behind prison walls for decades. And it's uglier than anyone wants to admit. Because according to this man, Tupac Shakur wasn't just the victim of gang retaliation. And it wasn't just a feud gone too far. He claims Pac's murder was part of a calculated hit, greenlit at the highest levels of the industry, with names we still see celebrated today. And the bombshell detail? The man who claims to know the real story swears Pac's death could have been prevented if greed, betrayal, and power games hadn't sealed his fate. This isn't another conspiracy rabbit hole. This isn't vague whispers. This is coming straight from inside the same prison walls where Suge Knight himself spent years plotting, scheming, and, allegedly, confessing things that would shake the foundations of hip-hop forever. And the most shocking part? The cellmate insists Pac wasn't just killed, he was silenced. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. To understand the cellmate's confession, we have to go back, not just to the Vegas Strip on September 7th, 1996, but to the toxic web of betrayals, hidden beefs, and sinister deals that were already circling Pac like vultures. Because while the official story paints it as simple gang violence, the evidence we're about to walk through, interviews, first-hand accounts, even confessions from the men who pulled the trigger, points to something far darker. Take, for example, Keith D's own admission, where he openly described pulling up on Pac's BMW that night with Orlando Baby Lane Anderson in the back seat.
He's hanging out the window like he was in a parade.
Tupac.
Yeah, he was.
So what happens next?
And we just came, and shit. I ain't gonna go into the details like that, you know what I'm saying? But, you know, you got it in a book, you done played it, everything else, you know what I'm saying?
That alone is already damning, but there's more.
It looked like he was reaching, yeah. Yeah, it did.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did you actually see a gun?
No, once he got the reaching, I got the ducking.
So someone from your car
That's what happened.
started shooting at Tupac and Suge.
Here's where it gets chilling. According to Choke No Joke, who's investigated these cases for years, cops weren't just chasing random suspects. They were being fed information by insiders like Reggie Wright Jr., Death Row's own head of security, who at one point was considered a lead suspect in Biggie's murder. And yet, Wright himself allegedly told investigators that the Southside Crips killed Biggie because they didn't get their payment for killing Tupac. Think about that. A hit job with missing money at the center. And if money was on the table for Pac's head, then who was writing those checks? Gene Deal, a former bad boy bodyguard, went public saying he personally saw the check Zip told him was for the hit on Pac. Whether you believe him or not, that one detail changes everything. Because as Choke No Joke pointed out, who writes a check for a murder? Who in their right mind leaves a paper trail like that? Unless, of course, the person funding it felt untouchable. This is exactly why so many fingers pointed toward Diddy, especially after he repeatedly shut down questions about it. When directly asked if he ever put a hit on Tupac, Diddy brushed it off.
We don't talk about things that are nonsense. We don't even entertain nonsense, my brother. So we're not even going to go there, with all due respect, but I appreciate you as a journalist.
He called it nonsense, but the streets never stopped talking. And Suge's cellmate claims that's no coincidence. According to him, Suge himself admitted that money and betrayal inside Death Row set Pac up to die. This lines up with Dylan Dylan's story, where he recalled bad boy insiders telling him flat out that hatred for Pac wasn't just gossip, it was policy. Now, here's where Suge's cellmate drops the hammer. He says Suge confided that Pac was never supposed to leave Las Vegas alive, that the Southside Crips were just the triggermen, but the order came from higher up. And when you look at the timeline, it's hard to ignore. Pac had just been in the MGM Grand Brawl with Orlando Anderson. Hours later, the white Cadillac pulls up and shots are fired. Pac is hit 4 times. Suge somehow survives with just a graze to the head. He later told MTV that Pac was actually the one keeping him calm as they sped to the hospital. And yet, despite all the eyewitnesses, despite cops being told Pac's entourage member Yaki Gaddafi could identify the shooters, nobody was arrested. Weeks later, Gaddafi himself turned up dead. Convenient or cleanup? Meanwhile, Keith D would later confess in his memoir and in proffer sessions with cops, but then backtrack from behind bars, claiming his words were coerced, fed to him, or said for money. Suge's cellmate says this was by design. Pac's real killers wanted the narrative controlled, and scapegoats like Keith D kept the attention away from the real financiers. Let's pause here, because the hypocrisy is staggering. We're talking about an artist who gave voice to black pain, who rapped about injustice, who saw himself as a soldier in a war against systemic oppression, and yet the very industry that profited off his voice may have orchestrated demanded his silence. Even Pac's father, William Garland, said Tupac was constantly betrayed, shot 5 times at Quad, jailed on flimsy charges, and then gunned down again by people who should have been protecting him. Garland rejected the idea Pac was bipolar. He said Pac was simply a man scarred by endless betrayal. The Cellmate's testimony fits right into this pattern. According to him, Suge never once described Pac's death as random. He allegedly said the pieces were moved into place long before Vegas, that Pac was expendable the second he started pushing back against Death Row's control. And if that's true, then the question isn't who pulled the trigger. The question is, who benefited from Pac being gone? Death Row? Bad Boy? Diddy? The record industry as a whole? Maybe all of the above. And here's where it gets even messier, because the deeper you look, the more you realize Pac's death wasn't just about one night in Vegas. It was the culmination of years of enemies, paranoia, and power plays. Look at the pattern. Pac survives being shot 5 times in New York at Quad Studios. He comes out convinced someone he trusted set him up. Then he signs with Death Row while sitting in prison, effectively becoming Suge Knight's golden ticket. But what happens when Pac starts thinking about leaving? When rumors swirl that he's looking to go independent, to build his own label, cutting Suge out of the pie, suddenly Pac is dead. Coincidence or consequence? Even Suge himself admitted on MTV News just a week after the murder that Pac was talking about the future. Those were Pac's last words to him. But if Pac really believed he was gonna be straight, that means he had no idea how many knives were aimed at his back. And what about Diddy? The man has denied for decades that he had anything to do with Tupac's death. He calls the allegations nonsense and refuses to engage. But then you hear insiders like Dylan, who was signed to Bad Boy at the time, recalling heated confrontations where Pac's name alone sparked hostility. The other piece Suge's cellmate swears by is this: Pac's death wasn't just a business move, it was an insurance policy. Pac had become bigger than Death Row, bigger than Bad Boy, bigger than any one label. He was a revolutionary figure in hip-hop, and revolutions don't serve the powerful, they threaten them. Pac's own father, William Garland, echoed this in a rare interview years later. He said Pac wasn't unstable, wasn't reckless, he was betrayed. Garland insisted Pac wasn't bipolar, but instead a man whose mood swung because the very people he fought for, the very people he trusted, constantly turned on him. Shot in New York, imprisoned on shaky charges, targeted again in Vegas. That doesn't sound like bad luck. That sounds like a coordinated effort to break him down. And when you add in Keef D's shifting confessions, first admitting he was in the Cadillac, then claiming later he only said it under pressure or for money, the picture gets even uglier. The one man charged with Pac's murder now insists he was railroaded, while pointing fingers back at Death Row insiders like Reggie Wright Jr. Meanwhile, Wright himself was running Pac's security that night. So how does the head of security, the man paid to protect Pac, end up in the circle of suspects tied to setting him up? This is the world Suge's cellmate describes from inside prison, a tangled mess where loyalty was bought, betrayal was constant, and Pac was walking around with a target on his back long before September 7th, 1996. According to the cellmate, Suge confided that Pac's shooting wasn't random gunfire, it was a checkmate. And if you don't believe a cellmate's word, look at the trail of bodies and silenced voices around this case. Yaki Gaddafi, who said he could identify the shooter, ends up dead 2 months later. Other potential witnesses either vanish, refuse to talk, or conveniently contradict themselves. Even the supposed confessions are tainted by coercion and contradictions. And through all of it, one thing stays consistent: the people who stood to gain the most from Pac's silence, whether in LA, New York, or corporate boardrooms, remain untouched. So when Suge's former cellmate breaks his silence, what he's really doing is pulling back the curtain. He's telling us what Suge told him in confidence, that Pac wasn't just killed in Vegas, he was sacrificed by a system that profits from young black men dying violently while their music lives on. It's why nearly 3 decades later, we're still arguing over who pulled the trigger, when the real question is, who pulled the strings? Who decided Tupac Shakur had to die? Because if Suge's cellmate is right, the streets never really killed Pac. The streets were just the cover story. The money trail, contracts, checks, and cover-ups. If the previous part left you shake and buckle up, because the second half of Suge's cellmate's story doesn't just suggest Pac was targeted. It paints a picture of an industry where everybody had something to gain from his silence. Think about it. Tupac Shakur wasn't just a rapper. He was a cultural lightning rod, a man who fused Black Panther politics with West Coast gangster rap, a man who could fill arenas one night and rally crowds with revolutionary rhetoric the next. For some, he was dangerous, not just because of his music, but because of his ability to move people. And according to the cellmate, Suge Knight understood this better than anyone. From behind those prison walls, he allegedly told stories that made it clear Pac's death wasn't only about gang beef or a casino brawl, it was about control. Let's break down what that means. On the night of September 7th, 1996, Pac should have been untouchable. He was rolling with Suge Knight, the most feared man in hip-hop. He had an entourage, security, and the entire death row machine behind him. Yet somehow, a white Cadillac full of Crips managed to pull up at a red light and unload bullets in into his chest. How does that happen unless someone on the inside made it possible? And here's the kicker. Multiple people close to the case later suggested that Pac was actually planning to leave Death Row Records. Rumors swirled that he wanted to start his own label, Machiavelli Records, a move that would have robbed Suge of his biggest star and his biggest payday. The Cellmate claims Suge admitted he knew this, and it made Pac's loyalty a ticking time bomb. In Suge's own words, Pac wasn't just his artist, he was his insurance. Without Pac, Death Row's power collapsed. But if Pac was gone, Suge could still own the music, the royalties, the myth. Dead rappers don't renegotiate contracts, and this is where the bad boy connection comes crashing back in. Choke No Joke laid it out bluntly. Investigators were told Southside Crips killed Biggie in retaliation for not being paid after Pac's murder. In other words, Pac's death wasn't just a crime, it was a contract with payments promised and then disputed. And as wild as it sounds, Gene Deal swore he saw the check tied to that hit. Now, whether or not you believe there was a literal paper trail, the symbolism is clear. Pac's life was being discussed in the language of transactions. It wasn't personal, it was business. And Suge's Cellmate says this is exactly how Suge described it, not as a random tragedy, but as the cost of doing business at the highest level. But let's not forget the shooters. Keith D has confessed, retracted, confessed again, and now from behind bars insists he was railroaded. In one version, he says Orlando Anderson fired the shots. In another, he suggests Pac reached for a gun, sparking chaos. At one point, he even admitted, and yet today, he swears he didn't kill Pac, accusing Reggie Wright Jr. of being the real mastermind. Wright, of course, was running Death Row's security that night, the same security that mysteriously failed to protect their star. The Cellmates claim Suge hinted that both Wright and the Crips were part of a bigger chess move. Pieces moved into position so that when the moment came, Pac didn't stand a chance. And here's what makes it worse. Every time a voice tries to expose these connections, that voice disappears. Yaki Gaddafi, dead weeks after saying he could ID the shooters. Witnesses silenced, cops looking the other way, even media narratives warped. Tupac's own father, William Garland, blasted the Dear Mama doc for portraying Pac as unstable, calling it a distortion of the truth. He said Pac wasn't bipolar, he was betrayed. And if betrayal was Pac's constant reality, then Vegas was just the final chapter. Suge's Cellmate says this was the part that haunted Suge himself, because Pac trusted him. Pac believed Suge would protect him. Instead, Pac ended up in a passenger seat with a target on his chest. So let's ask the obvious. Why should we care almost 3 decades later? Why does Suge's Cellmate story matter now? Because it forces us to face a hard truth. Tupac's death wasn't about one man pulling a trigger. It was about an ecosystem that profits when black artists live fast, die young, and leave behind catalogs worth hundreds of millions. Pac wasn't just murdered, he was monetized. The Cellmate swears Suge admitted as much, that Pac's legend was worth more than Pac alive. And the fact that we're still debating his murder in 2025, still streaming his music, still quoting his words, proves he was right. But here's the catch. If Suge really confessed to knowing all this, then it means the people who ordered the hit are still out there, still rich, still celebrated, still untouchable. And here's the part that makes this whole story unbearable. Pac knew he was surrounded by enemies. He rapped about it. He spoke about it in interviews. He carried himself like a man expecting betrayal. Yet, in those final weeks, he still believed he had time. He still believed he could pivot away from Death Row, build something of his own, and finally wrestle back control of his destiny. That's the tragedy Suge's Cellmate says cuts the deepest. That Pac, for all his paranoia, didn't see Vegas coming. Consider this. Pac was only 25 years old when he died. Just 25. He had already survived shootings, prison time, and character assassination in the press. Most people would have quit, but Pac was preparing to fight harder than ever. He was recording like a man possessed, dropping tracks at a pace no one in hip-hop could match. And according to those closest to him, he was planning a revolutionary shift, independence, political activism, and global influence. In other words, he was about to become unstoppable, and that's what makes the Cellmate story so chilling. He says Suge knew Pac's independence meant Death Row's collapse. He knew Pac leaving meant losing power, money, and status. So instead of watching Pac walk away, forces around him made sure he never left. And the industry got exactly what it wanted. A martyr, frozen in time, selling millions from the grave. The final twist, how Pac signed his own death warrant. This is the part where Suge Knight's former cellmate drops the kind of revelation that keeps you up at night. Because it's not just about who pulled the trigger. It's not just about money. It's about Tupac himself, and how, without even realizing it, he signed his own death warrant. According to the Cellmate, Suge told him that Pac's greatest strength was also his greatest weakness, his fearlessness. Pac wasn't scared of anyone, not Diddy, not Biggie, not the Crips, not even Suge himself. He carried himself like a man who could not be touched. But in Vegas, that same fearlessness turned into recklessness. Hanging out of the BMW window, shouting at fans, squaring up with Orlando Anderson hours earlier at the MGM, Pac made himself a target. And the people who already wanted him gone, they didn't have to wait long for the perfect opportunity. Keith D even admitted it in one of his shifting stories about Pac Pac hanging like it was a parade. Imagine that. Pac, the man who had cheated death before, presenting himself wide open in the middle of Las Vegas. To Suge's cellmate, that wasn't just coincidence. That was destiny being manipulated. But here's the part no one saw coming. The cellmate claims Suge confessed that Pac was never meant to survive the shooting, that Suge himself wasn't even supposed to walk away. The Crips were supposed to finish them both, but something went wrong. The bullets grazed Suge instead of killing him. Pac, critically hit, fought for 6 days before dying in the hospital. And here's the kicker. Suge allegedly told his cellmate he believed someone in law enforcement knew the hit was coming and let it happen. Think about that. A drive-by on the busiest night in Las Vegas, right after a Tyson fight with cops all over the strip, and somehow nobody sees anything, no one is arrested. Witnesses like Yaki Gaddafi, who said he could identify the shooters, turn up dead weeks later. That doesn't sound like a botched investigation. That sounds like a cover-up. Now let's tie this back to the money trail. If Pac was leaving death row, Suge lost everything. If Pac was gone, Suge still controlled the master, the royalties, and Pac's unreleased music. And if Pac's death sparked sales, death row cashed in. Meanwhile, if the Southside Crips were promised money and that payment didn't come, then suddenly Biggie ends up dead in LA months later. A retaliation. See how the dominoes line up, but the cellmate swears Suge admitted there was one more layer. The real reason Pac was silenced wasn't just business, it was politics. Pac's father, William Garland, explained this better than anyone. He said Pac wasn't bipolar, as the media painted him. He was a young black revolutionary betrayed again and again. He grew up in the shadow of the Panthers. He carried that fire in his veins. And in the mid-90s, he was talking openly about change, unity, political power, starting movements. That terrified people. Garland said Pac believed in black people, loved black people, would do anything for black people, and that betrayal broke him. Now imagine Pac alive, independent, unchained from death row, rallying the same communities that once lifted Malcolm X, Huey Newton, and Fred Hampton. The cellmate says Suge believed that was the real threat, not the rap beefs, not the sales numbers, but the idea of Tupac as a revolutionary leader. And in that sense, his assassination wasn't just about music. It was about silencing a movement before it began. Even today, the contradictions are staggering. Diddy calls it nonsense whenever asked. Keith D confesses one day, denies the next. Suge goes on TV and paints Pac as joking, laughing, even comforting him on the way to the hospital. And yet from behind bars, his own cellmate claims Suge admitted Pac's death was no accident. It was orchestrated. The cellmate says Suge told him Pac knew, deep down, that he wasn't going to live long. That's why he recorded so much music so fast. That's why he spoke about death like it was already chasing him. He had accepted it. What Pac didn't know, the cellmate insists, is how many of the people closest to him were willing to help death catch up. So what do we do with all this? Almost 30 years later, why does any of this matter? Because it forces us to see Tupac's death not just as an unsolved murder, but as a case study in how power works. When an artist becomes bigger than the system reacts. When an artist becomes a revolutionary, the revolution gets cut short. And when the truth finally leaks out through interviews, through confessions, through a cellmate story, it's not to bring justice, it's to remind us how fragile truth really is. Pac's murder was officially labeled a gang hit. Suge Knight's former cellmate says it was an execution, and maybe that's the real reason this case was never solved, because the streets didn't kill Tupac, the machine did. And here's something else the cellmate said that still echoes years later. Pac's murder wasn't only about silencing him in that moment, it was about erasing what came next. Pac was days away from dropping the Don Illuminati, the 7-day theory under his new Machiavelli persona. He was already plotting his exit from death row, and he was speaking about politics with a fire that unsettled the very system he profited. Imagine what would have happened if Pac lived long enough to finish his vision. Movies, albums, his own label, his own army of artists. Imagine him taking the same revolutionary energy that terrified COINTELPRO in the 60s and channeling it into a new generation. The cellmate swears Suge said that was the final straw. Pac alive was uncontrollable. Pac dead was profitable. That equation sealed his fate. And this is where the tragedy becomes unbearable, because Pac himself predicted it. In songs and interviews, he spoke about dying young, about being a martyr. His father, William Garland, said Pac wasn't unstable. He was betrayed again and again until he expected death. When you piece that together with the cellmate story, it feels less like prophecy and more like Pac simply recognizing how the game was rigged against him. Think about how many voices were buried alongside Pac's. Yaki Gaddafi, dead before he could testify. Witnesses silenced. Even insiders like Keith D flip-flopping. All of it leaving a fog of confusion that only benefits one group, the people who already cashed out on Pac's name. Not just that Pac was killed by enemies, but that Pac's enemies were the same people shaking his hand, smiling in photos, counting money off his records. Pac wasn't just murdered in Vegas, he was betrayed in boardrooms. Artists still die young, labels still profit, fans still debate conspiracies while the money piles up. Suge's cellmate wanted the world to see that Pac's story wasn't an accident. It was a template, a warning, a machine that feeds on talent and spits out martyrs. And here's the cliffhanger that seals this expose. The cellmate claims Suge Knight never expressed guilt about what happened in Vegas. Not once. Instead, he spoke about Pac's death the way a CEO talks about a business decision. Cold, inevitable, part of the game. So if you're still asking, who killed Tupac Shakur, maybe you're asking the wrong question. Because according to the man who lived side by side with Suge, the answer isn't just one name. It's an entire system. And as long as that system exists, Tupac Shakur will never really rest in peace. That brings us to the end of this video. For more interesting videos like this, click on the cards on your screen.